Hi everyone, my name is Rebecca Tan and I'm the editor-in-chief of Asian Scientist magazine. We are Asia's leading science and technology magazine, covering everything from quantum computing to gene editing. It's now 5 p.m. here in Singapore right now and 10 a.m. over in London, where today's guest on Wildtype Expert Opinion is. I am really honored today to share the virtual stage with none other than Dr. Magdalena Skipper. She is the editor-in-chief of Nature. And now I'm assuming that everyone here knows what Nature is and how important it is to the scientific community as one of the leading journals in the world. But before we begin, just a few rules of engagement to ensure that we have a smooth webinar today. First of all of the attendees are on listen-only mode, so you will be able to see us, but we won't be able to see or hear you. But if you do have a question for Magdalena, please submit them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Can you see it at the bottom? Just a Q&A button. Alternatively, you can also raise your hand using the raise hand icon also at the bottom of your screen. This will be during the live Q&A session at the end of this webinar. Last but not least, just a gentle reminder that today's session is being recorded and will be made available online shortly after this webinar ends. So right now, I'd just like to introduce our guest today. Magdalena is the 8th person to serve as the editor-in-chief of Nature since it was first published in 1869. That's 151 years ago. After completing her PhD at Cambridge, she joined the famed LMB, or Laboratory of Molecular Biology, which has been described as the birthplace of modern molecular biology. In 2001, she joined Nature Publishing Group as the chief editor of Nature Reviews Genetics, before moving on to various other editorial roles and assuming the position of editor-in-chief of the flagship journal Nature in 2018. It's our great pleasure to have you here today, Magdalena. Welcome, Magdalena.
Hello, it's my great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation and welcome to my home.
Yes, so I understand that you operate out of the London office, but currently things are shut down right now because of the pandemic situation. How has the whole coronavirus situation affected the way you and your team work?
Yes, so you're absolutely right. I myself am based in London, in our London office, which actually is the largest office for Nature and many of other Nature branded journals. We of course have other editors who are based in New York, for example, also in Berlin and Shanghai for that matter. And so all of us globally are affected in one way or another, unfortunately, by the current pandemic. Our offices here in London closed just over 6 weeks ago. And I had to pause there to think about it because I don't know how many of you, but I certainly in the lockdown situation find that I lose track of time. It's an unprecedented situation for us. It's an unprecedented situation globally, but you asked specifically about how we're doing here in London in our offices. You know, in my very kind introduction that you gave to me, you indeed said that Nature is 150 now in its 151st year. This is for the first time ever in its history that Nature is being published with everyone working from home. So, of course, we publish material daily online, but the weekly magazine, the weekly journal, physical printed entity continues to be printed. That comes out every week. But all of us, all of the editors, all of the reporters, all of the production staff are working from home. As you can imagine, the first week or two when we had to readjust our schedules were really quite intense. This intensity continues, but necessarily we have settled into this new normality. It's of course completely impossible to imagine how this would work or could have worked 30 years ago or so when there was no internet and well, we could not have had this conversation, of course. It's a very, very different reality.
Yes, these are truly really unprecedented times. And Yeah, thanks for sharing how everything is changing. But before we continue, maybe we would just ask the audience some questions. I see that there are around over 200 of you here in the room today. We'll just do one poll to get started, just to find out where everyone comes from. So I'm launching the poll right now. Can you see it on your screens, everybody at home? So just share with us what your background is. Do you come from industry, in biotech, in pharma, or do you come from academia as a student or a faculty member, or are you from somewhere else? We'd just like to say hi to you as well. I'll give all of you a few more seconds to fill in your answers, and we will just round up in a few more seconds. Wow, a lot of you are voting, almost 80%, almost 90% now have given in your answers. Okay, and I will just end the poll here and share the results with everyone. So as you can see from the screens, most of you are students and postdocs. We also have quite a number of faculty members joining us today, and also quite a large number, 24%, who are others. We don't know exactly where you're from, but you don't fall under any of the categories that we've mentioned. So as you can see, yes, most of you are in academia, and understandably so, because Nature is a very important academic journal. So now let's just begin with another question for Magdalena. How many submissions a day does Nature receive during baseline period? And how many do you receive now in this time of COVID? When did you start to see that number change?
Very good question. So probably the best, I'll give you an illustration of how many submissions we get based on our last year numbers. And the reason why I think that's probably most illustrative is, of course, because submissions of original papers come in with some irregularity. So taking an average over a longer period of time makes more sense. So these data are actually, we always update this information on our website, so it's publicly available. So in 2019, we received, I forget the exact number, but just under 11,000 submissions.
Wow.
To Nature. And of course, you have to keep in mind that Nature is a multidisciplinary journal. We publish right across all disciplines of research and clinical, increasingly actually, clinical investigation also. So 11,000 papers. Let's say there are some 260 working days in a year, more or less. So, you know, that's just over 40 papers a day, maybe 40, yeah, just between 40 and 45 papers a day. We have seen a large increase of submissions over the past couple of months since, you know, it really all began at the beginning of the year. But of course, as the pandemic became apparent and research has been ramping up on this, on the virus and on the disease, we're seeing many more submissions. And that's not surprising. If you think about, think about when you listen to the media, to the general reports, we continuously talk about the need to monitor the situation. We're interested in epidemiological studies, how the number of cases and deaths are unfolding in different locations around the globe, what the scientists are doing in terms of understanding the basic biology of the virus, but of course the immune response to the virus also. There are cell-based tissue culture studies, there are animal model studies, there are in silico studies and you know, biochemical and chemistry studies, of course, as well as the clinical reports from about the symptoms and the responses of the patients and how the disease unfolds. And of course, increasingly, reports of various early stage trials of potential treatment. Now, that is only the work which is in one way or another directly related to the pandemic. But of course, consider the fact that in most places around the world, access to laboratories and research facilities has been restricted or completely stopped. This, of course, means that many researchers are beginning to work extra hard to finish off the work for which data have already been collected, or maybe analyses are almost finished. So at Nature, we're actually seeing a large increase of submissions right across the different disciplines. And, you know, my colleagues who work on other Nature titles, such as, for example, Nature Physics or Nature Chemistry, they themselves are seeing a large increase of submissions also. So it's not just the research directly relevant to this coronavirus strain and COVID-19.
Yes, so if I hear correctly, you used to get around 40 submissions a week, is that right? And if
A
it
day.
has a day, sorry, 40
A day.
submissions a day. So has that gone up to like double or more than that?
So it's certainly doubling up, and you know, as I say, daily
Yeah.
submissions are so fluctuating
Mm.
that it's over a short period of time. It's uninformative to look at that, but
Yes.
certainly we're seeing, and all journals, I believe, are seeing much increased numbers of submissions of research.
Okay. We briefly touched on this just now, but Nature has a very low acceptance rate of around 7 to 8%. So for a scientist, being published in Nature is actually seen as some kind of a stamp of approval. Does this endorsement effect influence your decision to publish controversial research, especially about COVID-19?
Interesting question, and it's actually a very complicated question because you touch on many aspects. So if you think about how science publishing or research publishing works, when you publish your work, of course, the work needs to be peer reviewed if you're publishing in a journal. By definition, that means that publishing in any journal constitutes a stamp of approval because you've been approved by the editor who is considering your manuscript, but also by selected members of your peer group who have evaluated this work and deemed it to be appropriate for publication in that particular journal. So publishing in a journal always is associated with a stamp of approval. Indeed, the more selective the journal is, so the smaller the percentage of accepted manuscripts, of course, the more stringent the conditions for acceptance are. For Nature, we always look, and this is right across the disciplines that we consider, we always look for, of course, rigor of science that is being done, that is appropriately described. We look for novelty. We look for, often we look for elegance in the research that is being done, an influence on the field, but also on a bigger community of researchers, because Nature is a multidisciplinary journal. And so we strive for these studies that may have applications and implications for fields beyond the one in which the study has been done. Now, you asked about controversial studies. You know, there's a saying that goes, extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. And that indeed is always sort of a maxim that the editors, but also the research community, broadly speaking, would apply itself to any extraordinary claim that we hear. The same applies for a paper, as well as, let's say, for a conference presentation or a poster presentation, any form of communicating of scientific information. So the editors, when they receive and evaluate manuscripts, and I should explain for those who are maybe not so familiar with the way we work at Nature, is that at Nature we have full-time professional in-house editors. So these are individuals who used to be researchers at some point. All of them have PhDs. Almost all of them, I believe, have postdocs, as far as I remember. Some of them have had quite an extensive research career before moving to becoming editors. So those editors work in the fields with which they're familiar, where they have their own research background. When they evaluate a manuscript which makes a potentially controversial, a particularly, let's say, provocative claim, they would pay extra attention to the weight of evidence that supports that claim. we all know that science progresses. Science is not immutable in that sense. As new evidence, technologies, methodologies, tools, and so on come to light, we revisit questions, we can revise our position. So just because something appears to be controversial does not mean it cannot be considered, but it has to be considered appropriately, with appropriate care. Now, at a time, and this applies to every research, every piece of research at any point in time. At the time of pandemic right now, where almost all the eyes are on the virus, on the disease, and on the desire to contain it, and treat it, and subsequently prevent it or even eliminate it, we have to be extra careful because the potential dissemination of inappropriately supported results can have more deeply reaching consequences more quickly, precisely because the whole topic, the whole subject area is in the spotlight for understandable reasons. But as I say, I emphasize the fact that that rigor, that scrutiny applies to all claims at all times.
I see. Thanks for that very insightful answer. It's a related question, but for an editor, how do you prioritize which COVID-19 papers to publish and which to maybe ask for more experiments?
So again, the answer actually will be similar for whether it's a COVID-19 paper or another paper. Very clearly, the papers which have appropriate level of support, experimental support, for the claims that they make. So in other words, the claims are not overhyped, not too far reaching. They are the papers which are always prioritized by editors for sending for peer review. Manuscripts which are preliminary in the sense that they look and seem promising, but are not sufficiently supported by evidence or overstretch the claims, the editors will often enter into discussion with the authors to find out what is possible, or indeed whether the best course of action is actually to bring the claims step down so as not to overclaim the conclusions, because the conclusion as it's supported by the data may well be of interest in itself. At a given time. So this is a process that the editors are very used to going through, the sort of logic that they are working through. And as I say, this applies to every single paper. We must remember that just because there is an incredible sense of urgency in the context of public health and global health, we cannot compromise the rigor of the research and the reporting of the research that is done.
Great. Yeah, definitely not. Speed should not come at the expense of quality, for sure.
Absolutely.
Right now, I'm just going to run another poll to check with our audience. So this poll is on whether you personally have ever published a research paper in a preprint server. And now that it's becoming more normal, given this evolving situation, whether you would do so if you have another paper coming up soon. So I see people logging in their answers right now. I'll just give everyone a few more seconds to put in your answers. Again, there are two questions. Firstly, have you done so before? Have you published in the preprint before? And are you likely to do so now that this is the new normal for us, especially for biomedical research, where it's not so common to publish in a preprint? Okay, I think I will stop the poll very soon. Okay, here, I will stop the poll now, and I will share the result with you. So very interestingly, most people here, and our audience is largely academic, have never published in a preprint before. 80% of you have never done so, but 67% are very likely to do so in the future. So we can already see that COVID-19 is changing the way that people think about preprints. And with that, let me move on to a question that was submitted by one of the audience members beforehand. This is a question by Professor Stefan Schuster. He's a research director at CELSI, which is a research institute at Nanyang Technological University of Singapore. And he is in the room right now. But I'll just read out his question, which he submitted earlier. His question is, why not have a Nature COVID-19 journal to address issues with preprint servers not being supported by many medical journals? What do you think about that idea, Magdalena?
What an interesting question. Before I move on to the question, can I just say how illuminating your question, your survey question was for me just now. I almost feel compelled to ask a question to the audience, although I'm not sure we have this technology for it right now. But it's fascinating that the majority of people had not used the preprint server before, but now their opinion has changed. I would love to understand why. What is it about the current pandemic that has changed that opinion of this group? Very interesting. So let me turn to the question from Professor Stefan Schuster and answer it in a broader context as well. So as you know, and I suspect most of the audience and many of you in the audience know, the concept of preprints has been around for a very long time. In fact, the concept of preprints is pretty much as old as the World Wide Web. And it was invented, it was started in the subset of communities in the physical sciences. So the oldest preprint server is arXiv. Now, Nature, of course, is a multidisciplinary journal, and a large proportion of papers we publish are in the physical sciences. So submitting a paper to us, to our pages, and publishing in Nature has always been compatible with deposition of preprints, because a large proportion of the community we work with and serve adopted preprints very early on. The life science and biomedical community are the sort of new kids on the block, if you like. It's not so new anymore, and I forget exactly how old bioRxiv is, but bioRxiv was, of course, the first preprint server in the life sciences and biomedical space, and there are now so many others. And of course, medRxiv in particular has come to the fore in the context of COVID-19 and the current pandemic. It was very interesting. It was a very interesting experience for me to go through as an editor, and in fact for my predecessor, Philip Campbell, as editor-in-chief of Nature. When life scientists began to embrace preprints, we were continuously getting questions from authors. If I deposit a preprint, will I still be able to publish in your pages? And of course, the answer to us was yes, resoundingly so. And we have published many editorials clarifying that situation over the last 10 years or so, however long bioRxiv has been around. Recently, at some point last year, we actually went further. Not only are we okay with our authors depositing a preprint before they submit to us or at submission to our pages for our consideration, but we actually actively encourage our authors to do so. And this is not just for Nature, this is across Springer Nature, which is the publisher of Nature. And Springer Nature publishes something like 3,000 different journals. So right across the board, we encourage authors to do that. Now for COVID-19 related papers, because we felt that in a situation which was evolving and unfolding so rapidly, with those papers, we actually specifically ask the authors to do so. So we will facilitate that deposition for them, as well as data sharing. In addition to which, we inform WHO of submissions that we receive. Of course, WHO has been collecting over many years data on epidemics and pandemics, and so this is absolutely crucial that that body, in order to influence its decisions, guide its decisions, that body is aware of research as soon as it's available and ready for submission and sort of prime time. So we at Nature have, right from the very beginning, as soon as the concept of a preprint was born, felt that preprints are complementary and completely compatible with journals. A preprint is not the same as a publication in a scientific journal. Preprints are not peer-reviewed. There is an initiative to peer review preprints, but that peer review process unfolds in a different way from the way that peer review is done on journals. And certainly on Nature, there is so much care and attention that goes towards careful selection of peer reviews, working and mediating between the authors and peer reviewers, then that process has a significant impact and makes a significant contribution to the final paper that is published by a journal, which is why I say that there is that complementarity and synergy with what a preprint brings, an opportunity to sort of unveil the work as it's written up rapidly, an opportunity for community-based comments. But then when a paper is published in a journal, that stamp of approval that you talked about earlier is there, not just from the journal, but from the experts in the community as well. The question, Stefan's question specifically, whether we could lodge a Nature COVID-19, there isn't really a need for it, because Nature itself, Nature Medicine, Nature Microbiology, Nature Immunology, and any other journal for that matter, where COVID-19 related work, for example, Nature Human Behavior, there's a lot of sociology and social sciences social science work associated with the pandemic. All these journals are completely compatible with preprint deposition. Yes, I hope this answers the question.
Okay, great to hear. It's really wonderful to hear how proactive Nature is when it comes to encouraging the use of preprints, not just allowing but actively encouraging.
Mm-hmm.
We'll just take one more pre-submitted question. This one is from Job Iloha from the University of the Philippines. And he asks, what is the best way to combat misinformation about COVID-19?
Yes, very important question and a really important task. It's, as always, with any misinformation, I think what's absolutely paramount is pointing to and evaluating the source of information. Is it a credible source? To what extent the report that is being provided is balanced? And the question, or rather what I'm suggesting now, applies in equal measure to those who are consuming the information for their own benefit or for further dissemination, as well as to journalists, media professionals, and anybody who's communicating information about COVID, or for that matter, any other piece of news. It's important that, especially at times like this, when, as I said earlier, all the eyes are on COVID-19 related topics, that all of us who have relevant expertise, whether it is, whether you are a health worker, whether you are a researcher who's studying the basic biology of viruses or infection or immunology, whether you're a clinician, whether you're a statistician or epidemiologist, the list continues. That you use your voice to share your expertise, to comment, either in real life conversations. These days, of course, they tend to happen over this kind of medium because we are all social distancing and self-isolating, whether it's on social media, whether it's in other form of communication. The more expertise we have engaged in counteracting misinformation, the more successful we're going to be in dispelling, quite frankly, some extraordinary claims which are being made, in some cases, in very prominent ways. So my advice and plea at the same time for all of you in the audience is, if you feel qualified in an aspect of research which is relevant to the pandemic, please use your voice. You have an opportunity, and I would say you have a responsibility to do that as well.
Yes, yeah, especially here at Asian Scientist Magazine, we feel that responsibility every day.
I'm sure, yes.
I would like to now take a few questions from the Q&A. So we've got about 15 questions there now. Let me just pick on one of them. This question is from Cheng Kai Lim. And his or her question is, due to the ever-increasing number of submissions received every year, and particularly in this time where there's an increased pressure to publish scientific evidence to guide policy making and decisions, are there any new procedures or changes being made to the current way of reviewing papers to assist this process? For example, maybe machine learning models for vetting the papers and so on. What do you think about this idea, Magdalena?
Very important question. So I would touch on two aspects of the question, the policy, speaking to the policymakers, and then the machine learning aspect. So speaking to the policymakers is something that Nature, and I'm sure other publications as well, have been thinking about for quite some time. And of course, COVID-19 focuses the mind in terms of the urgency of doing so. But that interface, that interaction between science and policymakers is ever present. Think about anything related to the current concerns around sustainability across the globe. There is so much research going on into topics such as climate change, biodiversity, food security, and many other topics which are one way or another encompassed within the UN Sustainable Development Goals. There's a fundamental layer of research which underpins each of these topics, but immediately, as soon as one thinks of these topics, and of course many others in medicine also, one thinks of policy implications, which then have implications on the lives of us all. And the real question, the real challenge is, how do you build that bridge? How do you build the bridge between researchers, practitioners of science or medicine or any other walk of research? How do you build that bridge between them and policymakers? And as often is the case, it's a question of providing sense of relevance, providing, articulating the messages in the right, using the right language, and indeed relevance and context. So Nature, in many ways, is very fortunate because, of course, in addition to publishing original research, right from the very start when we were first published, we've always had what we call the so-called magazine part of our publication. So through journalism, through opinion and comment, expertly authored opinion and comment, we do engage with policymakers, advisors to policymakers, and advisors to governments. And often we provide a platform for their own voices to be expressed in our pages. And that provides the sort of the common stage for the researchers and those other professionals to talk to one another. I think this is a very important aspect. It's an ongoing journey. I'm not saying we have it solved. In fact, I know we don't. We need to continue to work on this. I think we are seeing, partly because of what I mentioned through UN SDGs, through the current pandemic, we are seeing a greater recognition of that need to connect research and policy. And so we will continue to work with all constituents to play our part in making it happen. Now, in terms of machine learning approaches to peer review, this is a fascinating area. You know, I would like to say that I remember once somebody rather flippantly challenged me to say that, you know, in a few years to come, I will be replaced by a program, a sophisticated program, and human editors will not be at all required. Well, of course, I would like to think that this is not the case. I can imagine being assisted by machine learning approaches, but that element of human experience, knowledge, and curation, I rather suspect in my lifetime will not be completely superseded by machine learning approaches. But I think that there is a really exciting future in which we look for this complementarity and synergy. And I think certainly we at Nature have not explored it anywhere enough. And I rather suspect that most publishers are only beginning to imagine how they could harness that potential. So ask me again in 10 years' time, maybe.
Yeah, I'm curious to find out if I will be replaced as well. So this is a really popular question from the Q&A. It's got a lot of upvotes, and it comes from Chester Drum. So what his question for you is, what personality traits got you into your current position? Was it management skills or your scientific acumen or just plain old hard work?
Ooh, well, you'd better ask that question to those who appointed me, I suppose. It's the reality is it's an impossible question for me to answer, but let me tell you what I find most useful in actually being editor-in-chief of Nature. There is no question that my long-term experience, I've been an editor of one type or another for almost 20 years now. My long-term experience is absolutely invaluable. Working with different communities, and my research background is as a geneticist. I have worked firsthand as an editor mainly with the genetics and genomics communities, but of course subsequently in my other roles I've extended my my focus to working with other communities, and of course now at Nature very clearly essentially all research communities. That experience is absolutely invaluable. We would not exist if it wasn't for the research communities. We work with them and serve them. And so understanding the needs, how best we can support them is absolutely paramount in what we do collectively, but also what I do specifically. So experience is absolutely invaluable. What is also invaluable, indeed, is the fact that I used to do research firsthand myself. Yes, I left the lab a long time ago, but the principle of how research is done, what it entails, what it is that researchers have to go through, intellectually, but also on the practical daily basis, I think understanding of that insight is really important. Of course, not all disciplines work in the same way, have the same dynamic. And in those disciplines where I don't have first-hand experience, I deliberately reach out to practitioners of those disciplines to gain really quite granular insight into how that works. The other thing I think which is really important in my role, and I have certainly benefited from, is ability to listen. And that is important both internally when I work with my colleagues. Many of them are experts. In fact, most of them are experts in something that I am clearly less of an expert than they are in. And it's absolutely crucial that I listen to their point of view and their advice. But of course, it goes without saying that the same is necessary when I talk to members of the research community, or indeed the media, or anybody else who wishes to talk to me about anything in relation to Nature. Perhaps not surprisingly, you won't be surprised to hear that as I get older, I get better at listening. I think we all do. So this is a skill which I have come to appreciate increasingly. Weighing up different points of view can only happen at the end of a listening process, and I think that's really, really important. I think hard work was mentioned in the question. We all know that we have to work hard. Without hard work, there's no progress, there's no growth. And speaking of growth, the last thing I will mention, I think, is curiosity. I think that's what, and I'm sure that actually the whole audience will identify with, is the reason why you're here on this call, the reason why you do what you do is because you're curious. And that curiosity has never left me. It continues to drive me. I don't think it will ever leave me. And that's an important personality aspect. And I certainly hope it never leaves you, all of you who are listening to me right now.
That's really wonderful. Yeah, I think curiosity is at the heart of a lot of it. We are running a little bit short on time, so I would like to take some questions from the floor right now. If you have a question, do raise your hand, and I will see who to pick based on the hands raised. Are there any other people asking questions? Okay. Uh, Let me just unmute one person. Um, Lefteris, I'm going to unmute you in a short while, and you can ask your question. Okay, please go ahead, Lefteris. Can you hear us?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we do. Could you please introduce your name and where you come from, and
Uh,
then finally ask your question?
sure. So I'm Lefteris. I am currently working in a medical device startup, but I joined after doing my PhD in Singapore in NUS.
Yes.
And I also I'm interested in doing science communication. So what I wanted to ask is, what is your opinion about having open science in journals now in COVID-19, actually sharing all the data that they're getting? And how does that, do you think, have actually helped the current situation?
Okay, thank you, Lefteris. Magdalena, what do you have to say about that?
The short answer is it's absolutely essential. It's essential now in the time of this pandemic, but at any point in any epidemic, you may remember almost every time that there is an epidemic, for example, the recurrent epidemics of Ebola in Africa, or other epidemics. You know, when we had Zika popping up in different parts of the world some 5 years ago or so, 4 or 5 years ago, at every single stage there, because the situation is evolving so fast, having open data, sharing data in real time is absolutely crucial. Now, just to take a step back, sharing data should be part and parcel of doing science anyway. This is something that at Nature and other journals, part of the Nature research portfolio, which collects together Nature and other Nature branded journals, we actually promote open data and shared data very actively. We require our authors to make statements, open statements about availability of the data. If research is going to be useful and reproduced so that it can be built upon, data have to be shared. And of course, some data cannot be truly open because they are personal, there are ethical considerations, but that doesn't mean that these data cannot be shared in a controlled way. So data sharing is paramount to doing science, to good science practice, and to scientific progress. And we will absolutely champion this. And in fact, the more we can encourage authors, but also new disciplines to adopt this shared data approach, the better job we will have done.
Right. And with that, unfortunately, we've run out of time. Magdalena has another appointment to run off to right now. But for those of you who have enjoyed our session today, we will next be talking to Sir David Lane, the Chief Scientist of the Agency for Science, Technology and Research in Singapore, and also well known as the discoverer of the P53 tumor suppressor gene. So if you'd like to find out more about COVID immunity and antibody drugs, do join us on the 6th of May. You can sign up for the webinar in the links in our social media channels. Last but not least, just from one editor-in-chief to another, thank you so much, Magdalena, for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to join us today. I really hope that one day in the future we might get to meet in person after all of this is over.
I hope so. Thank you very much. This was really interesting. My
Yes.
pleasure.
Thank you so much, Magdalena. And goodbye to everyone, as we are just signing out from Singapore and from London. Thank you very much for joining us.